Hello everybody, I'm Seth Weissman and welcome to another episode of Safe Real Estate. You know, as much as I dislike the form entitled Property Sold with Right to Request Repairs, it is a form which is being used with increasing frequency. So I thought I would talk today about some of the issues which arise when you use that form. And at the top of the list is the question of what exactly is a defect that the buyer can ask the seller to repair or replace. And as everyone knows, what the form says is that when you use the property sold with right to request repairs, the buyer can only have the property inspected and can only ask for the repair of defects. And if the seller is willing to fix the defects, the buyer must buy the property. And if the seller is unwilling to fix all of the defects, then the buyer can terminate the contract and get the buyer's earnest money back. So what exactly is a defect? Well, it's defined in a variety of ways, but the most important of which is if the property has a code violation that is normally considered a defect, with one major exception. And the exception is if at the time the house was built, it was built in accordance with code, then it is not a defect, even if it today is a defect under current code. And that's something which all realtors should focus on very carefully. And let's look at a couple of examples of what that means. Let's say that a house you are inspecting or the professional inspector is looking at has aluminum wiring. Well, today, aluminum wiring is not permitted. So under today's code, it would be considered a defect. But if it was built at a time where aluminum wiring is allowed or was allowed, then what the form says is that is not a defect. But again, there's also one major exception to the rule, which is if anything creates an imminent risk of injury to persons or property, then regardless, it would still be considered a defect. So going back to our example of aluminum wiring, let's say hypothetically that sparks are flying out of a receptacle and it looks like the house could catch fire at any moment. And the sparks are being caused by weak connections in the aluminum wiring. Aluminum wiring, if the house was built at a time where aluminum wiring was allowed, it would not be considered a defect. But what would override that is if it is creating an imminent risk of injury. And in this case, it would be creating an imminent risk of injury if sparks are flying out of the receptacle. So in that situation, I would argue that the buyer has a right to insist that it be repaired because of the imminent risk of injury. Now let's look at a second example, which would be the lack of GFI outlets in a bathroom. That's a code violation today, but if the house was built at a time where GFI outlets were not required, it would not be a defect under the form. And is that creating an imminent risk of injury? I would probably argue that it is not. There's a risk of injury, but I would argue it is not necessarily an imminent risk. So the buyer could not, in fact, ask for the GFI outlets to be replaced. Now again, based on how the wording is written, there is some room for argument, and it is yet, in my opinion, another reason why the form, due to its lack of precision and almost a required lack of precision, to me is not an ideal form to use. I hope that this episode of Safe Real Estate is beneficial and that you have a better understanding of what the term defect means in the form. As always, it's great to see everybody. Please continue to tune in. Thank you.